I spent 9 years turning our dying medical courier business into a reliable network. At my brother's wedding, I expected our father to toast the child who saved his legacy. Instead, he handed the entire company to a son who had never worked a shift at 3 in the morning. I didn't argue. I just walked out. 14 months later, those same guests witnessed another toast, and this time, nobody was smiling. My name is Zoe Bridger. I am 35 years old, and if you live in or around Lexington, Kentucky, chances are I have held your life in the back of a refrigerated cargo van. I am the actual engine behind Bridger Vital Route, a medical logistics company specializing in the transport of diagnostic specimens, temperature-controlled pharmaceuticals, and urgent medical records. For the past 9 years, while the city slept, I was the one tracking severe weather patterns, recalibrating routing software, and ensuring that a cooler of fragile stem cells made it from a rural clinic to a central lab before the ice packs compromised the thermal barrier. My father, Randall Bridger, is the founder of the company. If you look at our glossy corporate brochures or our freshly updated website, his face is the one you will see. He has a brilliant, booming laugh, a thick head of silver hair, and the kind of handshake that makes hospital administrators feel instantly secure. He is the outward-facing charm of the brand. But charm does not keep a chain of custody intact. Charm does not answer the dispatch phone at 2 in the morning when a driver gets a flat tire on a dark county road with a cargo hold full of time-sensitive biopsy tissues. When I first came on board 9 years ago, Bridger Vital Route was barely breaking even. It was a glorified errand service, running basic courier routes with a fleet of 4 beat-up sedans. It was my father's side project, bleeding money and plagued by missed delivery windows. I stepped in and gutted the operation. I redesigned the entire routing schedule from scratch. I instituted rigorous training protocols for the drivers, built an unshakable chain of custody system, and implemented strict cold chain controls that allowed us to bid on high-tier medical contracts. Because of the systems I built, our revenue multiplied by 5 over the better part of a decade. I breathed life into a dying entity, trading my 20s and half my 30s for the privilege of watching the balance sheets turn from red to black. Then there is my younger brother, Mason. Mason Bridger is everything a Southern golden boy is supposed to be. He is handsome, smooth-talking, and carries himself with an effortless grace that makes people want to give him their money. He has a resume that reads like a tour of lucrative, short-lived obsessions. He sold luxury European sedans for 8 months. He pushed pharmaceutical samples for a year and a half. He tried his hand at high-end commercial real estate for maybe 10 months before deciding the market was too unpredictable. Mason has never stayed anywhere long enough to understand the crushing weight of real responsibility. He likes the thrill of the pitch, but he absolutely despises the grind of the follow-through. Our mother, Laurel Bridger, loves us both, but her love is distributed through a lens of profound, unconscious bias. In her eyes, Mason is a delicate instrument that requires constant tuning and applause. Whenever Mason quit a job or lost a client, my mother would pat his arm and offer him the best cuts of meat at Sunday dinner. "Your brother just needs a little encouragement, Zoe," she would tell me in the kitchen, lowering her voice as if shielding him from the harsh reality of the world. "He has so much potential. He just has to find his true calling. You, on the other hand, are my rock. You have always been so capable. You can always take care of yourself." She meant it as a compliment, but over the years, those words mutated into a convenient excuse. Because I could take care of myself. No one ever felt the need to take care of me. I became the designated shock absorber for the family, expected to absorb the blows and keep the machinery running silently in the background. My entire life exists within the hidden arteries of Lexington's medical community. I am not the face on the brochure, but I am the name in the cell phones of every crucial player in the region. I know the lab managers by their first names. I know the chiefs of surgery, the hospital administrators, the night shift security guards, and the exhausted phlebotomists. When a winter storm knocks out the power at a regional blood bank, they do not call Randall Bridger to hear a comforting platitude. They call my direct line. I am the one who coordinates the emergency generator drop-offs and reroutes the fleet to save thousands of dollars in perishable blood products. I am the one who speaks the harsh, unforgiving language of medical logistics, where a delay of 45 minutes can mean a delayed cancer diagnosis for a terrified patient. For years, my father would stand at the head of the table during family holidays, raising a glass of expensive bourbon, and make sweeping declarations about the business. "This company is a legacy for the two of you," he would say, looking back and forth between Mason and me. "Everything we are building is for the family name." But the way he said it always left a cold knot in my stomach. The phrasing was deliberately vague. I was never referred to as the architect, the director, or the future owner. I was just part of the collective "you two." Deep down, I began to realize that in my father's eyes, I was merely the mechanic. I was the hired help keeping the engine from exploding until the true heir was ready to take the wheel. I refused to look at the truth directly, burying myself in spreadsheets and compliance audits, convincing myself that hard work and undeniable results would eventually force them to recognize my ownership. The subtle, quiet injustices might have remained buried forever if Mason had not met Celeste Whitmore. Celeste is the only daughter of the Whitmore family, a name that carries heavy weight in Lexington. They have deep, generational ties to commercial banking and prime real estate development. When Mason announced their engagement a little over a year ago, the atmospheric pressure in my family shifted overnight. Suddenly, Mason was not just a charming drifter, he was marrying into a dynasty. The changes at work started small. My father began requesting detailed operational summaries from me, documents that he had ignored for years. He started taking Mason out to long, boozy lunches with our primary banking partners. Mason would occasionally stroll into the dispatch center, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than a driver's monthly salary, asking superficial questions about our routing software before getting bored and wandering back out. Then came the new vocabulary. Randall started dropping phrases into our weekly meetings that he had clearly picked up from the Whitmore's corporate advisors. He talked about optics. He talked about repositioning the company profile for institutional investors. "We are entering a new era. Zoe," my father told me one afternoon, leaning back in his leather chair. "With the wedding coming up, we have a unique opportunity to expand. The hospitals, the banks, they all want to see a certain kind of leadership. They want to see a stable future for the brand. A new leadership image. I have given them stability for 9 years. Dad," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the sudden pounding in my chest. "Our delivery success rate is at 99.8%. That is the only image the hospitals care about." "You are thinking like a dispatcher, sweetheart," he said, giving me a patronizing smile that made my blood run cold. "You need to think like an executive. It is about the narrative. People invest in a story." He did not elaborate, and I did not push him. I was too busy coordinating a massive recalibration of our cold storage units to fight him on abstract corporate philosophy. I told myself he was just trying to impress his future in-laws. I told myself that no matter what kind of narrative he wanted to spin for the banks, he could not run the company without me. I held all the keys, all the passwords, and all the institutional knowledge. I believed that my sheer competence made me indispensable, and therefore safe. I was wrong. Competence does not buy loyalty in a family that values a golden image over a calloused hand. I spent 9 years building a kingdom, entirely forgetting that I had never once been asked to put my name on the deed. Even on the morning of my brother's wedding, the logistical heartbeat of the city did not stop. At 6 a.m, while the bridal party was likely sipping imported mimosas in a plush hotel suite, I was sitting on the edge of my own unmade bed, frantically rerouting a climate-controlled transit van. A commercial freezer unit at a regional fertility clinic had suffered a catastrophic failure overnight. They had over 30 vials of irreplaceable genetic material that needed to be moved to a secure backup facility within 2 hours before the temperature variance destroyed years of patient hope. I dispatched our most reliable weekend driver, plotted the fastest route avoiding the morning highway closures, and stayed on the phone with the clinic director until the electronic manifest was signed and verified. Only then, with my heart still racing from the adrenaline of a narrowly avoided medical disaster, did I step into the shower to wash off the stress and put on my bridesmaid dress. I played the role of the good sister flawlessly. I stood for the photographs, I adjusted boutonnieres, and I kept my phone strictly on silent, checking the final delivery confirmations only when no one was looking. I appeared polished and serene, entirely hiding the exhaustion of a woman who had worked an 80-hour week just to keep the company afloat while the rest of the family celebrated. The reception was held at a sprawling, pristine horse farm just outside the Lexington city limits. It was the kind of venue that required a massive, non-refundable deposit a year in advance. The Whitmore family wealth was evident in every single detail. Over 200 guests mingled under a colossal sailcloth tent, illuminated by thousands of fairy lights draped from the canopy. Huge floral arrangements cascaded down the center of every table, and waiters in crisp white coats navigated the crowd carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. But as I looked around the room, I realized this was not merely a wedding reception. It was a high-stakes corporate summit disguised as a celebration of love. I recognized the faces in the crowd. There were senior partners from the primary law firm that handled our compliance contracts. There were commercial bankers who managed the Whitmore estate accounts. More importantly, there were several high-level hospital administrators and regional clinical directors sitting at the prime tables near the front. These were the very people I had personally negotiated with, the people who had my direct number saved in their phones, the people who trusted me to move their critical medical supplies. My boyfriend, Eli Mercer, stood close beside me, his hand resting warmly against the small of my back. He knew how depleted I was. We had talked about this night for weeks in the quiet darkness of our apartment. My father had been hinting at a major structural announcement for months. I had foolishly allowed myself to believe that tonight was the night. I thought Randall was finally going to announce his gradual transition out of the executive role. I thought, surrounded by the very people who relied on the rigorous systems I had built from the ground up, he would raise a glass and publicly acknowledge the daughter who had salvaged his dying business and turned it into a regional powerhouse. I stood there, holding a glass of sparkling water, quietly waiting for the validation I had earned with 9 years of my life. Dinner concluded, the plates were cleared, and the clinking of silverware faded as the formal toasts began. First came the best man with a predictable, mildly embarrassing story. Then Celeste's father took the microphone. He spoke of family expansions and merging futures in a sharp, calculating tone that blurred the line between a sacred marriage vow and a lucrative corporate acquisition. Then, my father stepped up to the microphone at the center of the dance floor. The massive tent grew completely quiet. Randall Bridger commanded a room faultlessly. He looked immaculate in his tailored tuxedo, his silver hair catching the warm, ambient light of the chandeliers. He started with the standard pleasantries, warmly welcoming the Whitmore family and praising the beautiful couple sitting at the sweetheart table. But then his posture changed. His tone shifted, dropping into that authoritative boardroom register I knew all too well. "Tonight is about much more than two people coming together," he said, his voice echoing cleanly across the manicured lawns through the expensive sound system. "Tonight is the celebration of a new chapter. It is a night of passing on a family legacy." I felt Eli squeeze my hand a little tighter. I adjusted my posture, preparing a modest, gracious smile. My moment was finally here. My father reached inside his breast pocket and pulled out a thick folded document. The gold seal of a notary public caught the light. "I have spent my life building Bridger Vital Root," he continued, delivering a masterclass in revisionist history that completely erased my existence. "But a company must always evolve. It must look to the horizon. And it is time the company had a suitable face to lead the next phase of our growth." He turned toward the sweetheart table. He did not look at me. He did not cast even a fleeting glance in the direction of the table where his daughter sat. "Mason," he said, holding up the thick stack of papers, "these are the transferred articles of incorporation and the majority shareholder agreements. As of this morning, Bridger Vital Root is yours. You are the new owner and the chief executive officer." A low murmur rippled through the tent, followed by a scattered, hesitant applause from the banking tables. But my father raised his hand to quiet them. He had one more thing to say, and it was the sentence that would permanently sever any remaining thread of loyalty in my heart. He looked directly at the hospital administrators and the financial backers seated at the VIP tables. "In our industry," Randall said, his voice smooth, confident, and utterly devoid of shame, "hospitals believe in stability, and a married family man creates that feeling. A stable family man is exactly what this brand needs to assure our partners that we are here for the long haul." The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt the blood drain from my face, not in a sudden rush, but in a slow, agonizing crawl that left my skin entirely cold. The betrayal felt like a physical electric shock traveling down my spine. The pain did not make me want to scream. It paralyzed me with a profound, terrifying clarity. Mason froze. For 3 long seconds, my younger brother sat perfectly still, his eyes darting frantically toward me for a fraction of a moment. He looked terrified, like a child who had just been handed the controls of a commercial airliner mid-flight. He knew he could not do the job. But then, the Whitmore side of the tent erupted into enthusiastic applause. Celeste placed a perfectly manicured hand on Mason's arm. She was not beaming with the soft joy of a new bride. She was smiling the sharp, predatory smile of an executive who had just witnessed a flawless, hostile takeover. Her gentle, firm push broke Mason's paralysis. He stood up, adjusted his expensive jacket, and walked over to my father to take the papers. They embraced. The hired photographer's flash went off, blindingly bright, capturing the exact moment my life's work was handed over as a ceremonial wedding gift to a boy who did not know the difference between a medical-grade cooler and a standard cooler. I did not cause a scene. I did not throw my drink, nor did I march up to the microphone to list the thousands of uncompensated hours, the sleepless nights, and the desperate saves I had executed to make those very papers worth millions of dollars. A public, tearful meltdown is exactly what they would have expected from an emotional, unmarried woman. I refused to give them the satisfaction of proving my father right. I would not let them paint me as the jealous, unstable sister. I looked at my father, who was busy shaking hands with a hospital director. I looked at the notarized folder now resting prominently on the sweetheart table next to the wedding cake. I looked at my brother's soft, uncalloused hands resting on top of the empire I had built with my own sweat and anxiety. "Let us go," I whispered to Eli. My voice was completely hollow, stripped of any emotion. Eli did not ask any questions. He did not offer useless platitudes or hesitate for a single second. He placed his hand firmly in mine, and together, we stood up. We turned our backs on the head table, the flashing cameras, and the stolen legacy. We walked silently through the sea of clapping guests, past the crystal centerpieces and the towering floral arrangements, and out of the luminous tent into the cold, dark Kentucky night. I left them to their applause, walking away with the absolute certainty that not a single person cheering in that tent had the slightest idea how to keep the company alive. I unlocked the front doors of the dispatch center at 5 in the morning. The Sunday sky was still a bruised, heavy purple, and the building was entirely silent except for the low, rhythmic hum of the main server racks. I did not bring a cardboard box. I did not plan on a dramatic exit. I carried only my personal canvas tote bag, walking straight to the back office where I had practically lived for a decade. I did not touch anything that belonged to the corporation. I left the dual-monitor desktop computer exactly where it was. I left the company-issued tablet and the corporate credit card neatly aligned next to the keyboard. I took only the things I had purchased with my own money to make their broken system function. I packed my personal laptop, the one I used because the company hardware was always too slow to process the complex routing algorithms. I gathered the 6 leather-bound notebooks filled with my handwritten contingency plans, severe weather protocols, and emergency contact trees. I took the specialized operational checklists I had designed and printed at my own expense. Standing in the center of the room, I pulled out my phone and drafted an email. It took less than 60 seconds to write. I addressed it directly to my father and my brother. I resign effective immediately. Starting today, you can run the company you chose. I hit send. I took my plastic security keycard from my lanyard, placed it flat in the dead center of my empty desk, and walked out of the building. I did not look back. By 8 in the morning, my phone began vibrating continuously. Mason left 7 voicemails in the span of 2 hours. I sat at my kitchen counter, drinking black coffee, and listened to his mounting panic through the speakerphone. "Zoe, please pick up," his recorded voice pleaded, the slick confidence from the night before completely gone. "You cannot just leave. It is just a formality for the banks. I do not even know how to log into the main dispatch software. Nothing is going to change. I promise you. Just call me back." He honestly believed his own words. He thought a title was just a piece of paper and that I would happily return to managing the heavy machinery while he wore the crown. But I understood the brutal mechanics of corporate power far better than my brother did. When the tectonic plates of a business shift, the person whose name is not on the operating agreement is always the first one swallowed by the earth. I knew that the moment a real crisis hit, the moment the profit margins dipped, the non-owner would be sacrificed to save the family image. I was not going to stick around to be their scapegoat. At 11 in the morning, I walked into the downtown offices of Mara Keene. Mara was a senior corporate attorney and my closest friend since college. She had seen the toll this job had taken on me, and she had cleared her entire Sunday schedule the moment I texted her. "I need to know exactly how thoroughly I'm locked in," I told her, sitting across from her wide mahogany desk. "I need to see the non-compete clauses, the severance restrictions, whatever invisible handcuffs my father buried in my employment file over the last 10 years. Tell me what I am legally allowed to do." Mara opened her laptop and accessed the state business registries and the employment records I had forwarded to her. She read through the digital files in silence. After a few minutes, her brow furrowed. It was not a look of confusion, but a look of mounting, quiet fury. She closed the laptop and looked at me, her expression a mix of professional shock and deep personal sympathy. "Zoe, there are no handcuffs," Mara said, her voice sharp and precise. "There is absolutely nothing here." I stared at her, genuinely failing to comprehend. "What do you mean I have run the entire operations division? There has to be a restrictive covenant. Every senior manager has one." "They never classified you as a senior manager on paper," Mara explained, leaning forward. "You are listed as an at-will, W-2 employee. You have 0% equity. You never signed a phantom stock agreement. You never signed a partnership contract. And because they never officially elevated your title to a C-suite executive, they never bothered to make you sign a non-compete clause or a non-solicitation agreement. Legally speaking, you are completely free to walk across the street and open a rival business tomorrow." The legal reality was incredibly liberating. The emotional reality was a devastating blow to the chest. I had poured my absolute prime into a machine that viewed me as nothing more than a highly competent, well-behaved housemaid. They did not lock me down with contracts because they never viewed me as a threat. They never imagined the workhorse would figure out how to unlatch the gate and leave the farm. My phone buzzed on Mara's desk. It was a text message from my father. I did not want to read it, but I tapped the screen anyway. It was not an apology. It was not a plea for me to come back. It was a cold, executive justification. "Mason needs this position to grow up," the message read. "He needs the responsibility to become the man he is supposed to be. You have always been strong enough that you do not need to be handed anything. You will be fine." I read the message 3 times. As I stared at those words, a strange, metallic calm washed over me. The dull, throbbing ache of a victim completely evaporated, replaced by the razor-sharp clarity of a survivor. This was not a misguided, impulsive wedding gift. My family had not made a temporary mistake under the pressure of wealthy in-laws. They had made a deliberate, calculated choice. They had sacrificed my future to subsidize my brother's maturity. "Print my records, Mara," I said, standing up from the chair. "I am done fighting to hold on to things that never had my name on them." I left the law office at 1 in the afternoon. By 7 o'clock that evening, Eli and I were sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor of our apartment living room. We had pushed the coffee table out of the way and spread out a massive roll of white butcher paper I had bought on the way home. "We are not going to argue with them," I told Eli, uncapping a thick black marker. "We are just going to build something they cannot touch." I drew a line down the center of the paper. On the left side, I started listing everything I had legally walked away with. I did not have a fleet of 20 refrigerated vehicles, but I knew the exact specifications and thermal tolerances of the temperature loggers required by state health codes. I did not have a massive, climate-controlled warehouse, but I possessed the personal cell phone numbers of the 30 most critical lab managers and clinical directors within a 200-mile radius. I knew the exact routes that the larger companies ignored because the profit margins were too tight or the delivery windows were too brutal. On the right side of the paper, I wrote down the absolute bare minimum we needed to start. We needed 2 used cargo vans. We needed commercial insurance. We needed 1 dispatcher. "I can wire the dispatch system," Eli said quietly, looking at the paper. "I can set up the server architecture in the spare bedroom by Tuesday. It will not be pretty, but it will be secure, and it will pass compliance." I nodded. Writing his name next to the technology column, I had no funding, no corporate backing, and no safety net. But as I sat on that floor, surrounded by lists of operational standards and regulatory codes, I realized something profound. For the first time in a decade, my mind was entirely my own. The knowledge I had accumulated was not bound by a family trust or an ungrateful father. It belonged exclusively to me. I signed the commercial lease for North Circuit Clinical Transit on a freezing Tuesday afternoon. The space I rented was not a sleek, glass-fronted office building. It was a drafty, cinder-block warehouse situated right off the industrial ring road, wedged between a wholesale tire distributor and a commercial plumbing supplier. The interior smelled faintly of stale motor oil, damp concrete, and old dust. I started my new empire with exactly 2 pieces of rolling equipment. I bought a pair of used, high-mileage refrigerated cargo vans at a municipal surplus auction. The white paint was peeling off the hoods, and the suspension groaned over every pothole, but the rear cooling compressors were structurally sound. My entire workforce consisted of myself and 1 part-time driver, a retired postal worker who only wanted to be behind the wheel for 3 days a week to get out of his house. I knew better than to try and win back the massive, glossy hospital contracts right out of the gate. Securing those deals required a fleet of 50 pristine vehicles, millions of dollars in liability coverage, and a marketing budget I simply did not possess. Instead, I scavenged the market. I actively hunted for the logistical scraps that the major corporate players deemed too difficult, too messy, or too unprofitable. I took the graveyard shifts that forced drivers to stay awake until dawn. I took the deep, winding rural routes through the foothills, where cellular GPS signals completely dropped out and you had to rely on paper maps and memory. I accepted the hyper-urgent weekend dispatch calls that required a fragile diagnostic specimen to be moved across 3 different counties within a brutal, unforgiving 2-hour window. Because I could not afford to hire fleet mechanics or dedicated night dispatchers, I simply became all of them. I spent my early mornings lying on a piece of cardboard underneath the chassis of the cargo vans, changing the heavy synthetic oil and replacing worn brake pads so we would not fail Department of Transportation inspections. I spent my afternoons manually calibrating the digital temperature loggers, ensuring they maintained a strict thermal environment down to the exact degree required by law. And I spent my nights sleeping in my clothes on a cheap, twin-sized air mattress in the corner of the warehouse. The emergency dispatch hotline was plugged into the wall right next to my ear, and I jolted awake every time it rang, instantly transitioning from deep sleep to high-stakes logistical planning. The first real crack in the local market came from a small, independent fertility clinic on the south side of town. The clinic director called my hotline on a Thursday afternoon, sounding completely frantic and deeply exhausted. She told me she had requested an emergency transport quote from my former company over a week prior. "I spoke directly to your brother," the director told me, her voice tight with frustration. "He promised to send an executive client liaison to evaluate our storage needs. He said we would have a customized proposal by Monday. No one ever showed up. No one even called to cancel. We are sitting on critical samples and we have zero transport infrastructure." My brother had looked at their patient volume and decided the account was too small to warrant his attention. I drove over to their facility within 20 minutes of hanging up the phone. I walked through their lab, assessed the volume of their cryogenic tanks, and quoted them a flat rate that left me with exactly zero profit after calculating fuel and commercial insurance costs. I took the contract strictly to build an impenetrable reputation where it mattered most. That hard-won reputation was severely tested less than a month later. A freak, late-season blizzard hit the region without warning, dumping heavy, wet snow across the state routes and paralyzing the city's infrastructure. At exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, the fertility clinic's main backup generator suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. They had a massive batch of time-sensitive genetic material nearing its critical temperature threshold. My part-time driver was completely snowed in at his house in the suburbs. There was no one else to call. I grabbed my heavy coat, threw 3 industrial thermal blankets into the back of my primary van, and drove out into the blinding whiteout. The roads were treacherous sheets of solid ice. It took me over 2 hours of white-knuckled, terrifying driving, sliding sideways across intersections and dodging abandoned vehicles on the shoulder, just to reach the clinic. I backed the van up to their loading dock, fighting the howling wind, and loaded the heavy specimen tanks into my active cooling unit. We secured the cargo with exactly 15 minutes to spare before the internal thermal threshold broke. I drove them safely to their secure secondary facility on the other side of the county. By the time the sun came up, the clinic's lab manager was calling every medical peer she knew, telling them exactly who had driven through a blizzard to save her patients' futures. Word of mouth in the tightly knit medical community moves far faster than any corporate press release. 3 weeks after the storm, the heavy corrugated metal door of my warehouse rolled open. Tessa Boone walked in, pulling the collar of her jacket up against the chill. Tessa was the most brilliant route dispatcher I had ever trained at my former company. She looked around the drafty, echoing space, folded her arms, and looked me dead in the eye. "I quit my job this morning, Zoe," Tessa said, her tone perfectly flat. "I cannot do it anymore." I offered her a cup of terrible break-room coffee, and she explained the absolute chaos unfolding across town. She told me that Mason had started overriding her meticulously optimized routing schedules. He was pulling the newest, cleanest transit vans off their designated medical routes and parking them outside the high-profile regional hospitals during peak visiting hours, purely for the visual marketing impact. "He delayed a critical rural oncology delivery by 3 hours, Tessa said, shaking her head in disgust. "He did it just to make sure the branded van was sitting in the drop-off circle while the hospital board of directors was taking a tour. He is playing dress-up with people's lab results. I will not work under a system that prioritizes a photo opportunity over patient care." I hired her right there on the concrete floor. I could not afford to pay her the standard corporate salary she was used to, so I offered her a minor equity stake in North Circuit Clinical Transit instead. She accepted without a second thought. With Tessa aggressively handling the phones and the routing architecture, Eli spent his weekends transforming our bleak concrete box into a highly disciplined command center. He scavenged flat-screen monitors from a bankrupt tech startup down the street. He rewired the warehouse's faulty electrical grid himself, pulling thick cables through the exposed ceiling joists. He installed a closed-circuit network of high-definition security cameras to monitor the loading dock and the cold storage units 24 hours a day. He built a custom digital dispatch board that hummed with absolute precision, tracking our 2 vans with military-grade accuracy. By the end of my 4th month in business, my personal bank accounts were dangerously close to zero. I was running on perhaps 4 hours of sleep a night, and my hands were permanently rough and calloused from wrenching on van engines in the freezing cold. My clothes constantly smelled like industrial surface sanitizer and diesel fuel. I was severely lacking operational funds, deeply lacking rest, and desperately lacking manpower. Yet, as I stood in the middle of that cramped warehouse, watching Tessa seamlessly guide our driver through a complex rural drop-off on Eli's glowing monitors, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. For the very first time since the night of my brother's wedding, I possessed something that my family could never manipulate, appropriate, or claim as their own. I had built a space where my labor actually belonged to me, and I finally held the absolute, uncompromised power of my own decisions. While Tessa and Eli were helping me build a fortress out of scrap metal and sheer willpower, my brother was busy playing the role of a visionary chief executive officer. Mason immediately abandoned our practical, low-cost operational philosophy and set out to reposition Bridger Vital Route as a premium medical logistics brand. He moved the company headquarters out of the functional industrial park and signed a 5-year lease for a sprawling, glass-walled suite in a downtown high-rise building. He hired a boutique corporate design agency to create a sleek, minimalist new logo. Soon, I saw targeted advertisements popping up on my social media feeds. The promotional videos featured dramatic drone shots of our freshly washed vans driving across scenic bridges at sunset, scored with uplifting cinematic music. He was bleeding tens of thousands of dollars on aesthetic branding and public relations consultants, while entirely ignoring the fact that the rear suspension on van number 4 desperately needed to be replaced, and the thermal seals on the older coolers were steadily degrading. Celeste was the driving force behind this polished new image. She convinced Mason that the future of the company lay in capturing the exclusive but high-end private wellness clinics, the elective cosmetic surgery centers, and the boutique concierge medical practices. She told him repeatedly that those specific names looked phenomenal on a prospectus for future investors. They aggressively courted these glamorous accounts, attending lavish networking dinners and hosting expensive catered lunches. In his desperate pursuit of the spotlight, Mason completely abandoned the unglamorous, steady, low-margin rural routes that had reliably paid the overhead and payroll for nearly a decade. To win those flashy new accounts from established competitors, Mason adopted a strategy of aggressive, reckless underbidding. He slashed our standard transport rates by 30% across the board. The fundamental problem was that my brother had absolutely no grasp of the intricate, razor-thin margins inherent to medical logistics. He did not calculate the surging price of commercial diesel fuel. He did not factor in the mandatory time-and-a-half overtime pay required for the night shift drivers who worked the graveyard hours. He completely ignored the expensive, routine recalibration of the thermal loggers, and he failed to understand the steep insurance premiums attached to strict compliance regulations. Every single time he proudly signed a new premium contract, the company effectively lost money. He was subsidizing his own corporate vanity with the company's shrinking cash reserves. The veteran staff saw the writing on the wall almost immediately. Men and women who had driven those demanding routes for me for years began to hand in their keys and walk away. The final straw for many of the seasoned drivers was Mason's absolute obsession with optics over operations. He would actively disrupt the tightly orchestrated, minute-by-minute delivery schedules just to have a fleet of pristine vans parked strategically outside a potential client's facility while he gave them a walking tour. He treated the drivers and the vital equipment like props in a theatrical stage play. A driver with 30 years of clean driving history quit on the spot when Mason ordered him to delay a rural oncology delivery by 2 hours, simply to ensure the branded vehicle was visible in the drop-off circle while a hospital board of directors walked past. The inevitable operational collapse did not take long to manifest. It happened on a busy Tuesday afternoon. Mason had replaced Tessa with a recent college graduate who possessed a degree in corporate communications but absolutely zero experience in high-stakes crisis logistics. When a massive pileup involving a commercial freight truck shut down the primary southbound interstate for 4 solid hours, the new dispatcher completely panicked. A massive shipment of highly sensitive biopsy tissues sat idling in standstill traffic under the blazing afternoon sun. The interior cooler temperatures slowly began to rise toward the danger zone. Because the young dispatcher did not know the intricate network of secondary county roads, nor the protocols for deploying emergency dry ice intercept vehicles, the samples arrived at the laboratory 3 hours past the viable window. The receiving hospital, one of the largest in the state, immediately suspended their $2 million annual contract renewal pending a full, exhaustive operational review. Even as the foundation of the company cracked visibly down the middle, my father refused to acknowledge the reality of his disastrous choice. Randall stood firmly by his son. He sat in boardrooms and told the nervous directors that growing pains were a natural, expected part of any corporate evolution. Business in the modern era requires a modern approach, my father proclaimed during an emergency board meeting, waving away the catastrophic delays as minor logistical hiccups. Behind closed doors, however, he spun a completely different narrative to shield his own ego. He told the extended family and his country club friends that the internal chaos was entirely my fault. He claimed my sudden, selfish departure had created a temporary vacuum of institutional knowledge, conveniently ignoring the fact that he was the one who handed the keys to a novice. Soon, my phone started ringing with familiar, demanding numbers. First, it was my mother. She left a voicemail that sounded entirely too casual for the severity of the situation. "Zoe, darling, your brother is just overwhelmed with the new systems," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Why do you not just come back to the office for 3 or 4 months? Just to help him navigate the transition period, it would mean so much to the family." Then my aunt called, attempting to appeal to my sense of familial duty and loyalty. Even my father sent a sharply worded, demanding email implying that my stubborn pride was actively damaging the family legacy. They all wanted me to return. They wanted me to quietly step back into the shadows and fix the sinking ship with my bare hands. But in all those voicemails, in all those emails, and in all those demands, not a single one of them offered to return the title they had stolen. They desperately wanted my labor, my expertise, and my sacrifice, but they still absolutely refused to give me the crown. But the true, undeniable validation did not come from my family's desperate attempts to reel me back in. It came directly from the open market. A few weeks after the interstate disaster, the secure phone line in my drafty warehouse rang. It was the director of a prominent regional pathology laboratory, a massive account I had personally managed and nurtured for years. They did not call to ask me if I could match Mason's artificially slashed prices. They did not ask for a loyalty discount or a promotional rate. They asked if I had the physical capacity to take over their primary night routes starting the following Monday. "Zoe, we are willing to pay a 20% premium over our current contract with Bridger Vital Route," the director told me, her voice perfectly serious. "We do not care about the price anymore. We just need the absolute peace of mind that our patient samples will actually arrive intact." They were actively fleeing the glossy, premium brand, walking away from the slick logo and the downtown office suite, to bring their most critical business to a freezing warehouse and 2 used vans. They did it simply because they knew I was the one directing the routes. That quiet, definitive migration of trust terrified my brother far more than any angry email or canceled meeting ever could. He was learning the hardest lesson in business: you can buy a pristine image, but you can never purchase genuine reliability. It was a Wednesday afternoon, around 4 o'clock, when the heavy steel door of my warehouse groaned open. The weather outside was a damp, biting gray, typical for late winter in Kentucky. I was standing next to a stack of industrial thermal coolers, holding a clipboard and running down a daily maintenance checklist with Tessa, who was simultaneously managing 2 driver routes on her headset. When I looked up toward the entrance, I expected to see a delivery driver returning from a shift, or perhaps the property landlord. Instead, I saw my mother. Laurel Bridger stood just inside the threshold, looking entirely out of place. She wore a tailored wool coat and pristine leather boots, carrying a designer handbag that likely cost more than my monthly lease for this entire building. The air inside the warehouse was thick with the smell of ozone, cold, damp concrete, and the sharp tang of industrial surface disinfectant. It was a harsh sensory assault compared to the plush carpets and soft acoustic paneling of my brother's new downtown executive suite. My mother did not immediately speak. She simply stood there, letting her eyes wander over the raw, unpolished reality of my new life. She looked at the exposed aluminum insulation peeling from the ceiling. She stared at the dry erase boards bolted to the cinder block walls, completely covered in complex, color-coded route maps and strict driver schedules. She watched Eli's customized server rack humming in the corner, a tangle of heavy cables feeding into the glowing monitors that tracked our vehicles in real time. This space was barely 500 square feet of usable floor area. It lacked a reception desk, a waiting room, or even a proper coffee machine. Yet, as she watched Tessa seamlessly reroute a driver around a traffic accident in under 40 seconds without breaking a sweat, I saw a profound realization wash over my mother's face. She was watching a masterclass in operational efficiency, executed in a room that most corporate executives would not even consider fit for dead storage. I handed my clipboard to Tessa, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked over to her. I did not offer a hug. I pulled up a battered aluminum folding chair and gestured for her to sit. "I am surprised you found this place," I said quietly, taking a seat on an overturned plastic shipping crate opposite her. She kept her purse on her lap, clutching the handle with tight, nervous fingers. "I asked your aunt for the address. She found it in the public state registry filings." We sat in the ambient noise of the warehouse for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked the artificial, placating sweetness she had used in her previous voicemails. It was quiet, grounded, and heavy with a guilt I had never heard from her before. "I went to Mason's office yesterday," my mother began, staring at the scarred concrete floor. "It is beautiful. It looks like a magazine cover, but the phones were ringing constantly, and no one was answering them. Drivers were shouting at dispatchers. Mason was locked in his office with his public relations consultant. It was absolute chaos disguised as luxury. Coming here today, stepping into this tiny box, and seeing how smoothly you have everything running, I finally understand what we threw away." I did not interrupt her. I let the heavy silence hang, forcing her to fill it. "Your father did not make that decision at the wedding on a whim," she confessed, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It was not a sudden burst of emotion. He had been planning the transfer for over 6 weeks." I felt a cold tightness in my chest, but I kept my face entirely impassive. 6 weeks. They had sat across from me at Sunday dinners, asked me to pass the salt, and smiled while actively drafting the legal documents to strip me of my life's work. He met with the commercial banking directors and the Whitmore family trust officers multiple times, my mother continued, her eyes welling up but refusing to spill over. They all looked at the projections. They looked at the expansion goals. And your father genuinely believed that institutional investors and massive hospital conglomerates would hesitate to hand multi-million-dollar contracts to an unmarried woman. He told them you were too rigid, too sharp, too focused on the technical work to play the political game. He convinced them, and himself, that a married man, a man with a wealthy, established wife, would project the kind of traditional stability the industry demanded. The sheer absurdity of the prejudice was staggering. My technical work was the only reason the company had a reputation to sell in the first place. "And you agreed with him," I stated. "It was not a question." My mother flinched. "I did not stop him. I told myself that you were always so resilient. You never asked for help. You never complained about the hours or the stress. I thought you were too sharp, too independent to need our protection. I realize now that we took your competence, your absolute dedication, and we used it as a justification to punish you. We penalized the most capable child simply because the other one required constant saving." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of company letterhead. She slid it across the wooden crate toward me. "There is something else you need to know," she said. "I found this printed on the receptionist's desk at Mason's office. It is an internal memo they circulated to the senior staff the morning after the wedding." I picked up the paper and read the brief, sterile paragraphs. My pulse hammered in my ears. According to the official corporate narrative crafted by my father and brother, I had not been pushed out. The memo explicitly stated that the board had generously offered me a substantial equity package and a promotion to Chief Operating Officer. It claimed that I had formally declined the offer because I did not want to commit to the long-term strategic vision of the brand and desired to pursue smaller, independent ventures. They had stolen my legacy, and then they had stolen my reputation. They painted me as a flighty, uncommitted employee who walked away from a golden opportunity, effectively insulating Mason from the anger of the veteran staff. My immediate, visceral instinct was to strike back. I had the personal cell phone numbers of every driver, every lab manager, and every hospital administrator in their contact list. With one mass email, I could expose the complete lack of any equity offer. I could release the financial realities of their underbidding scheme. I could burn their carefully curated public image to the ground in less than 24 hours. I looked at the memo, and then I looked at the bustling, hyper-focused energy of my own warehouse. Tessa was currently locking in a lucrative weekend route that Mason had deemed too complex to bother with. My drivers were loyal, my systems were bulletproof, and my conscience was entirely clean. I folded the paper precisely in half, and then in half again, and dropped it into the small plastic trash can beside my desk. "Are you not going to correct the record?" my mother asked, her eyes widening in genuine surprise. "They are lying about you to the people you trained." "I do not need to fight a ghost," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. "If I send an angry email, I just look like a bitter, jealous sister." That plays exactly into the narrative they want. I am not going to engage in a public screaming match over a fabricated memo. I am going to let the failure of their routing schedules and the success of mine do all the talking. Results are significantly louder than public relations. My mother stared at me, a profound mixture of sorrow and awe softening the sharp lines of her face. She saw, perhaps for the very first time, the impenetrable armor I had been forced to forge over the last decade. The internal softness I felt toward her in that moment was real, but it was heavily guarded. I was no longer the daughter desperate for her approval. I was a woman who had survived her betrayal. She slowly stood up from the aluminum chair, smoothing the front of her coat. She did not reach out to hug me. She did not beg for my immediate forgiveness, and I respected her immensely for that restraint. She knew that apologies without actions were just empty syllables, and too much damage had been done to be erased by a single conversation in a freezing warehouse. She walked toward the heavy steel door, her expensive boots clicking sharply against the concrete floor. Just before she pushed the door open to step back out into the gray afternoon, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. "I got so used to relying on you being strong that I did not have to protect you," she said, her voice cracking just slightly on the final word. Then she pushed the door open and walked away, leaving me exactly where I belonged, standing in the center of the world I was building with my own two hands. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, carrying the weight of a monumental shift. It was a formal invitation to submit a proposal for a master logistics contract from the largest independent healthcare network in the state. They were looking for a single vendor to manage the secure transport of diagnostic specimens and urgent pharmaceuticals across 4 entire counties. The projected annual revenue was enough to permanently alter the trajectory of my entire operation, moving us from a scrappy underdog to a major regional player. I did not receive the packet through a blind public bidding portal. The document was sent directly to my personal inbox by Dana Voss. Dana was the senior director of clinical operations for the network. 2 years prior, during a catastrophic regional power grid failure, Dana and I had spent 36 straight hours on a conference line, manually coordinating the evacuation of frozen blood plasma from 3 flooding hospital basements. She remembered exactly who had kept the thermal barriers intact when the primary backup generators failed. She knew my name, not my father's, and certainly not my brother's. That was the sole reason North Circuit Clinical Transit was invited to compete against the massive corporate fleets. Winning this contract would require an astronomical leap of faith and a terrifying amount of capital. To meet their strict volume requirements, I had to expand my infrastructure immediately. I needed to secure a minimum of 6 additional refrigerated vehicles within 45 days. I had to negotiate a $3 million commercial liability insurance policy, construct a heavy-duty walk-in cold storage unit inside my drafty warehouse, and hire a full-time dedicated compliance officer just to handle the daily regulatory audits the hospital network demanded. If I submitted the bid and won, I would have to leverage every single asset I owned, drain the small profit I had managed to save, max out my personal credit lines, and bet my entire future on a massive gamble. While Tessa and I were hunched over the aluminum conference table, calculating the staggering monthly premiums for the expanded vehicle insurance, my cell phone vibrated loudly against the metal surface. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I stepped away from the logistical maps, walked over to the loading dock doors to get away from the noise of the dispatch radios, and answered the call. Randall Bridger did not open the conversation with small talk. He did not ask how my small business was surviving the winter season, nor did he offer any belated apologies for the humiliating display at the wedding. His voice was entirely stripped of its usual booming, executive confidence. It sounded thin, strained, and vibrating with an underlying, frantic panic. "Zoe, we have a catastrophic situation on our hands," my father said, skipping any polite pretense. "The state health department initiated a surprise internal audit on our central hub yesterday morning. They pulled the electronic manifest from the last 90 days. Mason has had a string of severe chain-of-custody documentation failures. The auditors are threatening to place the entire corporation under a formal corrective action plan by Friday. A formal corrective action plan was a death sentence in the medical logistics industry. It meant the state regulatory board essentially took over your operational oversight, publicly flagging your company as a severe risk. Hospital administrators would begin terminating their contracts the very next day to protect their own medical liability and patient safety scores. "I need you to come back to the executive office," my father demanded, his tone shifting rapidly from panic to that inherited, desperate authority he always used when he needed me to fix a crisis. "Just for a few weeks. You know the senior compliance inspectors. They respect your work. You can smooth this over and rewrite the operational protocols. We need to protect the family reputation. Zoe, if we lose the hub certification, we lose absolutely everything." I leaned my shoulder against the cold steel of the doorframe, watching a delivery truck back into the neighboring lot. The pressure he was trying to apply was a heavy, familiar weight, twisting professional duty with toxic emotional blackmail. "I am not coming back, Dad," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of anger. "I am not going to clean up a regulatory disaster that I did not create, but you do not have to worry about me actively sabotaging him. If the state investigators contact me, I will only answer the specific questions they ask regarding my tenure. I will not invent stories, and I will not offer vindictive testimony to ruin him. I will simply tell them the objective truth about the systems I left behind. What Mason did with those systems after I walked out the door is entirely his responsibility, not mine." My father hung up the phone without saying another word. The silence on the line felt heavier than any insult he could have hurled at me. The true magnitude of their corporate collapse walked through my warehouse doors less than 4 hours later. Mason arrived entirely unannounced. He drove himself, parking his expensive luxury sedan haphazardly next to my peeling, high-mileage cargo vans. When he walked into the harsh fluorescent light of the dispatch floor, I barely recognized the man who had confidently accepted my life's work just 14 months prior. He was not wearing a tailored, expensive suit. He wore a wrinkled blue button-down shirt, the collar completely unbuttoned and the tie missing entirely. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes were bloodshot, and he carried the distinct, hollow look of a man who had not slept a full night in weeks. The polished, golden boy veneer had completely shattered under the crushing weight of genuine operational terror. He did not look around at the bustling warehouse or acknowledge Tessa working the radios in the corner. He walked straight toward me, his hands shaking slightly as he shoved them deep into his pockets. "They are going to shut us down, Zoe," Mason said, his voice cracking with raw desperation. The state auditors found 8 critical temperature deviations that the new dispatchers completely failed to log. The major hospitals are already threatening to pull their overnight routes before the weekend. I do not know how to fix the compliance software. I do not even know where the original maintenance logs are stored on the server. He took a deep, ragged breath, looking around frantically before focusing back on me. "Come back," he pleaded, stepping closer. "I am formally offering you the Chief Operating Officer position. I will give you a 50% profit-sharing agreement. I will even go to the corporate lawyers tomorrow morning and amend the primary ownership documents. I will give you real equity, whatever you want. Zoe, name your price. Just please come back and stop the bleeding before we lose everything." I looked at my younger brother. A year ago, that exact offer would have felt like the ultimate, hard-won victory. It would have been the validation I had sacrificed my 20s and half my 30s to achieve. But standing there now, with the regional hospital bid sitting on my desk and my own independent network running flawlessly, his words sounded completely hollow and pathetic. He was not offering me an equal partnership. He was trying to sell me a burning building at a steep discount. He wanted to hand me a shattered, worthless vase and call it a generous executive gift. "Mason," I said softly, feeling a strange, detached sense of pity rather than any triumphant vindication. "You cannot offer me a share of a company that is currently in freefall. You do not want a partner, you want a shield. And I am entirely done taking the hits for this family." His shoulders slumped, the last ounce of his manufactured corporate confidence draining out onto the cold concrete floor. "What am I supposed to do?" he whispered, looking down at his expensive leather shoes, sounding exactly like the lost, directionless boy my mother always felt compelled to rescue from his own mistakes. I crossed my arms, looking at the brother who had taken everything from me without a second thought, without a single objection. I did not throw his failure in his face. I did not scream, and I did not demand a groveling apology for the wedding toast. I simply gave him the absolute, unforgiving truth of the industry he had so eagerly claimed to understand. "You need to stop selling a premium image," I told him, keeping my tone perfectly level and strictly professional. "You need to fire the public relations firm today. You need to call every single lost client, get them on the phone yourself, and apologize to them using real, verifiable data. You do not use a winning smile. You do not talk about the dynamic future of the brand. You show them exactly where the logistics failed, and you show them the mathematical steps you are taking to fix it. That is the only language they respect." Mason stood there in the center of the warehouse in complete silence. He absorbed the brutal reality of my words, finally realizing that charm, an expensive marketing video, and a wealthy last name could not negotiate with a state health inspector or a furious hospital administrator. He turned around without saying goodbye and walked slowly back out to his car. I watched him drive away, knowing that the empire I had built was finally collapsing. Not because I had pushed it over, but because no one left inside had the fundamental strength or knowledge to hold up the walls. The official ruling from the state health department arrived on a Friday, and it hit Bridger Vital Route with the force of a wrecking ball. The auditors did not just issue a warning, they placed the entire corporation under a formal corrective action mandate. This meant the state essentially shackled the company's operations, forcing a grueling, microscopic review of every single logistical process. The state regulatory board published their findings in the public registry, turning my brother's operational failures into front-page industry news. Almost immediately, the remaining hospital administrators began actively hunting for legal loopholes to terminate their contracts. The sleek, premium brand that Mason had tried to build was rapidly suffocating under the crushing weight of public incompetence. But the regulatory disaster was only the first domino to fall. The true fatal blow came from the financial sector, exposing a secret my father had buried deep within the corporate ledgers. When Mason married Celeste, Her family had facilitated a massive private bridge loan to help Randall fund the aggressive modernization of the brand. What no one outside of my father's inner circle knew was that Randall had secretly collateralized nearly every tangible asset the business owned to secure that money. He had mortgaged the original fleet of vehicles, the long-term client contracts, and even the legacy routing software I had built, all to bankroll a beautiful, flawless handover ceremony. The Whitmore family's financial advisors were ruthless. The moment the state issued the corrective action mandate, it triggered an obscure early maturity clause in the loan agreement. The bank demanded immediate, full repayment of millions of dollars. The company accounts were virtually empty, drained by Mason's marketing campaigns and artificially lowered transport rates. The financial exposure completely shattered the illusion of the power couple. Celeste Whitmore was raised in a world where wealth was supposed to be a quiet, unshakable foundation, not a fragile house of cards propped up by high-interest debt. She began to visibly pull away from my brother. She stopped visiting the expensive downtown office suite. She stopped attending the lavish networking dinners. Celeste finally realized the bitter truth: she had not married a rising chief executive officer. She had married a glorified mascot. She had tied herself to a man who was handed an empire he had no idea how to rule, and the resentment began to freeze their marriage from the inside out. It was late on a Thursday night when my phone vibrated. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing insurance policies, when Mason's name appeared on the screen. I answered, expecting another desperate plea for me to come back and save his sinking ship. Instead, I heard the sound of a man who had completely surrendered. "I am not calling to ask you to fix it, Zoe," Mason said. His voice was incredibly quiet, stripped of all the frantic energy from his visit to the warehouse. "I know it is over. The bank is going to seize the main accounts by Tuesday. I just needed to tell you the truth." I set my pen down and listened to the heavy silence on the line. "I knew I could not run it," he confessed, his words heavy with exhaustion. "Even at the wedding, when Dad handed me that folder, I felt like I was going to be sick. I knew you built it. I knew you were the only one who understood the machine, but my entire life, Dad looked right past me unless I was failing at something and needed to be rescued. He always praised your competence behind your back while treating me like a project. For one night, I just wanted him to stand up in front of a room full of important people and choose me. I wanted to be the golden child. I grabbed the company because I wanted to feel, just for a second, like I was the one he respected." That confession made me stop completely. I closed my eyes, absorbing the tragic, pathetic reality of my brother's words. He was not a cartoon villain. He was not a calculating, malicious thief who had plotted to steal my life's work. Mason was simply a warped, damaged product of the exact same toxic family dynamic that had exploited me. Our parents had weaponized his insecurities just as thoroughly as they had weaponized my competence. It did not erase the damage he had done, but it extinguished the burning anger in my chest, replacing it with a profound, heavy sorrow. While my father's legacy crumbled into dust, my own future was solidifying into something terrifyingly real. Dana Voss called me personally to deliver the news. North Circuit Clinical Transit had officially won the Regional Hospital Network master bid. I had secured a multi-year contract that would increase our daily volume by 400%. However, the victory came with intense, unforgiving conditions. The hospital network's legal team presented a contract filled with brutal control milestones. If my drivers missed a delivery window by more than 15 minutes, we faced massive financial penalties. If a temperature logger deviated by even a fraction of a degree without an immediate intercept protocol, we could lose the entire agreement. It was the absolute biggest opportunity of my professional life, but the pressure was physically suffocating. I had bet my entire livelihood on this single contract. I immediately began hiring. I leased 6 additional refrigerated transit vans and aggressively recruited the best talent in the city. The most satisfying moment of the expansion was welcoming the veteran drivers who had been discarded by my brother. Men and women with decades of flawless driving records walked into my warehouse, grateful to be back under a system that valued precision over public relations. Mason had pushed them out because their worn boots and calloused hands did not fit the pristine, glossy aesthetic he wanted to project to investors. I hired them on the spot, giving them premium weekend routes and full benefits, knowing that their gritty experience was the exact foundation my new empire needed to survive the hospital contract. Through all the chaos, the financial ruin, and the public humiliation, my father retreated into a haunting, unnatural silence. Randall Bridger had spent his entire life dominating rooms with his booming voice and absolute, unquestioned authority. He had always believed that a father's mandate was the law, and that any problem could be solved with a firm handshake and a confident assurance that everything would be fine. But he could not charm the state health inspectors. He could not intimidate the Whitmore family's banking attorneys. And he could not force the hospital administrators to trust a son who was actively destroying their supply chains. For the very first time in his life, my father was forced to stand by and watch his legacy burn to the ground, entirely powerless to stop it. He had chosen the picture-perfect image over the gritty reality, and the reality was finally collecting its massive, unforgiving debt. The invitation arrived on thick cream cardstock. My mother was hosting a formal dinner to celebrate her and my father's 40th wedding anniversary. The location, printed in embossed gold lettering, made my stomach turn the moment I read it. It was the exact same luxury horse farm where my brother's wedding had taken place just over a year ago. My mother framed the event in a carefully worded message, claiming it was time for the family to finally sit down together like adults. I knew better. My family did not do casual dinners. They did carefully staged performances. I did not agree to go because my anger had completely subsided. I went because I was entirely exhausted by the endless purgatory of vague voicemails, the awkward silence during holidays, and the half-hearted attempts at reconciliation that never actually addressed the profound betrayal. I was not looking for an apology anymore. I just wanted to close the door permanently. I arrived at the venue precisely at 7 o'clock in the evening. Eli walked beside me, his presence serving as a quiet, grounding force against the rising tension in my chest. We were directed away from the manicured lawns and ushered into the farm's private wood-paneled dining room. The moment I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere in the room wrapped around my throat. This was not an intimate family gathering. There were nearly 30 people seated around a massive, polished mahogany table. I saw Arthur, the senior attorney who managed my parents' corporate estate. I saw their lead financial advisor. I even spotted a few of the wealthy investors and retired hospital board members who used to play golf with my father. It was far too many people, and entirely the wrong crowd, for a simple celebration of 4 decades of marriage. We took our assigned seats near the far end of the table. The air was thick with the clinking of heavy silver and the low, strained murmur of forced, polite conversation. Mason sat directly across from me. He looked significantly worse than he had when he visited my warehouse. He looked entirely hollowed out, staring blankly down at his pristine white cloth napkin as if it held the answers to his ruined life. Celeste sat next to him, sitting perfectly upright, projecting an aura of absolute, freezing detachment. She had not spoken a word to anyone since we arrived. After the main courses were cleared by the catering staff, my father stood up at the head of the table. He picked up his crystal glass of expensive red wine. The room instantly fell silent. This was the moment the stage had been set for. Randall Bridger looked around the room, settling into the familiar, booming cadence of a chief executive holding court. He started with a few predictable remarks about his enduring love for my mother, praising her patience over 40 years. But within 3 minutes, the speech pivoted sharply away from their marriage and steered directly into the wreckage of his business. The last year has brought unprecedented challenges to our family and our enterprise, my father announced, his voice carrying that polished, artificial weight. The medical logistics market has experienced a violent shift. We faced extreme industry pressures, aggressive regulatory changes, and an unpredictable economic climate that no one could have successfully forecasted. I gripped the edge of the mahogany table, my knuckles turning white. He was doing it again. He was weaving a protective blanket of corporate jargon to cover his own fatal, arrogant mistakes. Sometimes, Randall continued, looking sympathetically toward the financial advisors, you do everything right. You follow the traditional leadership models, but the market forces simply overwhelm the foundation. It was a matter of unfortunate timing and bad luck. We fought a valiant fight against a shifting tide. The sheer audacity of the lie made my vision blur. He was standing in the exact same geographic location where he had publicly stripped me of my legacy, attempting to rewrite history for a second time. He was trying to convince the room, and himself, that the company collapsed because of an invisible economic monster, not because he had handed a highly technical, high-stakes operation to an inexperienced boy simply because that boy had a wife and a recognizable last name. I pushed my chair back from the table. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I was not going to scream, but I was absolutely going to walk out, just like I did on the night of the wedding. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that my mother had not invited me here to heal. I had been invited to serve as a silent prop, a visual confirmation of family unity to help my father save face in front of his wealthy peers. If I sat there and listened to his revisionist history, my silence would be taken as a passive endorsement of his lie. Before I could fully stand, a voice cut violently through the heavy air of the dining room. "Stop talking, Dad." The entire table froze. My father blinked, his wine glass hovering in midair. The interruption had not come from me. It had come from Mason. My brother slowly pushed himself up from his chair. He did not look at the lawyers. He did not look at the financial advisors. He looked directly at our father, standing at the head of the table. "Just stop," Mason said again, his voice trembling slightly but carrying a raw, desperate honesty I had never heard from him in my entire life. There was no shifting tide. The market did not suddenly collapse. The regulatory changes were exactly the same as they were 2 years ago. We did not fail because of bad luck. Randall's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. "Mason, sit down. This is not the time or the place to discuss internal operational metrics. There is no company left to protect. Dad," Mason fired back, his voice rising, tearing through the polite, suffocating atmosphere of the room. "The bank seized the accounts on Tuesday. The state pulled the final operating certifications yesterday morning. It is gone. All of it is entirely gone." A collective, silent gasp rippled through the guests. The financial advisor looked down at his lap. My mother covered her mouth with her trembling hand. Mason turned his head and looked directly across the table at me. His eyes were completely bloodshot, filled with the agonizing clarity of a man who had finally hit the absolute bottom. "We failed because you gave the keys to someone who had absolutely no idea how to start the engine," Mason said to the entire room, refusing to look away from me. "Zoe built every single system that made that company valuable. Zoe secured the contracts. Zoe kept the hospitals happy. I did not know how to calibrate a temperature logger. I did not know how to route a night shift. I just wanted to wear the expensive suit and be the son you finally respected." He turned back to our father, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his own public confession. "You chose the picture over the person who actually did the work, and I let you do it because I was too weak to admit I was not capable. Zoe built it, Dad. I just drove it straight into a concrete wall." The silence that slammed down on the room after Mason's words was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that left absolutely nowhere for anyone to hide. My father stood frozen at the head of the table, his mouth slightly open, the grand illusion of his legacy completely shattered by his own golden child. Then, the silence was pierced by a tiny, sharp sound. It was the distinct clink of heavy metal hitting crystal. I looked toward Mason's right. Celeste had not gasped. She had not argued or tried to comfort her husband. She sat perfectly still, her face an unreadable, icy mask. Slowly, deliberately, she had slid the massive, flawless diamond wedding ring off her left hand. She placed it carefully on the polished mahogany table, resting it right against the base of her water glass. She did not say a single word. She did not need to. That tiny metallic click echoed louder than any screaming match ever could. It was the sound of a lucrative merger being formally dissolved. She had married the heir to a medical logistics empire, and now that the empire was officially declared dead, the transaction was canceled. I remained in my seat, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. The air in the room felt entirely devoid of oxygen. The lawyers stared at their plates. My mother wept silently into her napkin. Mason stood there, entirely stripped of his pride, his marriage, and his inherited throne. Every single eye in the room eventually drifted toward Randall. He was entirely cornered. The carefully constructed narrative of the unfortunate economic downturn was dead. He could not blame the market. He could not blame the state auditors, and he could no longer blame me. The truth had been violently dragged out into the open by the very son he had broken the rules to protect. As I watched my father struggle to find his breath in the heavy, judging silence of the room, I realized the ultimate reality of the night. If Randall Bridger took another sip of wine and tried to spin one more excuse, if he continued to hide behind corporate jargon instead of facing the devastation he had caused, he would not just lose the remaining scraps of his ruined business. He would permanently lose the right to be called a decent father. The heavy, suffocating silence in the dining room stretched out for what felt like an eternity. Everyone stared at my father. Randall Bridger looked down at the mahogany table, his eyes tracing the gold rim of his crystal wine glass. He looked at the flawless diamond ring Celeste had abandoned next to her water goblet. He looked at Mason, who was slumped in his chair, stripped of all his manufactured pride. Finally, my father looked across the long table at me. Slowly, his fingers released their tight grip on the wine glass. The polished, untouchable executive persona completely dissolved, leaving behind an aging, defeated man who had finally run out of lies to tell. He did not sit down. He stood taller, gripping the back of his chair, and addressed the room in a voice entirely devoid of corporate bravado. "My son is right," my father said, his voice rough and stripped of its usual booming resonance. There was no unpredictable market shift. There was no sudden industry pressure. The collapse of this company rests entirely on my shoulders. He looked at the lawyers, then at the financial advisors, and finally back to me. 14 months ago, in a room very much like this one, I stood in front of 200 guests and I handed my life's work over to Mason. I told everyone it was a strategic move for the future. I told myself it was the right image for the brand, but that was a lie. I gave the business to the child who was easier to explain to the world. I wanted a son in a tailored suit to parade in front of the banking boards. I chose a comforting, traditional picture over the brilliant woman who actually built the foundation we were standing on. And that was not a simple management error. It was an act of profound moral cowardice. My mother closed her eyes, tears spilling silently over her cheeks. The attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they were no longer attending a dinner party, but witnessing a complete professional and personal surrender. "Zoe Bridger," my father said, speaking my full name aloud to the room, giving it the heavy, undeniable weight it had always deserved. "Zoe is the one who designed the compliance systems. She kept the clients loyal. She saved the massive hospital contracts when the storms hit. She created the entire reputation that made Bridger Vital Root worth anything at all. When I raised my glass to toast her brother that night, I committed the single greatest stain on my entire life." He let out a long, shaky breath. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thin, folded document. "The bank is taking the downtown office," my father continued, his voice breaking slightly. "They are seizing the primary operational accounts. But I still hold the legal rights to the original company name, the lease on the old secondary warehouse, and a handful of the remaining rural routes that the receivership has not yet liquidated. Zoe, I want to sign it all over to you. I want to transfer the corporate entity, the name, and what little equipment is left, free and clear. It is the only way I know how to return the justice I stole from you." He slid the document across the polished wood. It stopped precisely in the center of the table. A year ago, I would have fought a war for that piece of paper. I would have sacrificed another 10 years of my life just to hear him say those words. But as I looked at the legal transfer form, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, pragmatic clarity. I stood up from my chair. I did not raise my voice, and I did not let a single tear fall. "I appreciate the honesty, Dad," I said, my voice steady and echoing cleanly in the quiet room. "But I will not accept it. I refuse to take ownership of a dead brand. I do not want to inherit the corpse of a lie. The name Bridger Vital Root means absolutely nothing in this industry anymore, except failure and compliance violations. I am not going to spend the next 5 years of my life trying to scrub the dirt off a ruined legacy." My father looked at me, completely stunned. He had offered me the ultimate concession, and I was leaving it on the table. "However," I continued, adopting the sharp, clinical tone of an executive negotiating a liquidation, "I know you have 7 operational refrigerated transit vehicles parked in the impound lot, along with refrigerated storage units. I will buy those physical assets from you for exactly what they are worth on the open market, but I will only sign the purchase agreement on one strict condition. 100% of the funds I pay must be placed into a legally binding third-party escrow account. That money will be used exclusively to pay the outstanding wages of your dispatchers, settle the debts with your local suppliers, and secure the severance packages for the drivers you laid off. You will not see a single penny of it." I looked at the senior corporate attorney, who gave a slow, respectful nod of agreement. "I am not going to step in and save the family myth," I told my father, looking him dead in the eye. "I am going to continue building a company that actually carries my name. I am standing on the truth now, and I do not need your belated pity to keep the lights on." I turned away from the table, took Eli by the hand, and walked out of the dining room. Mason followed me out into the cool night air. I stopped in the gravel parking lot and turned to face him. He did not cry, and he did not offer any pathetic excuses for his incompetence. He simply looked at me with a quiet, devastating resignation. "I am leaving the logistics industry completely," Mason said, zipping up his light jacket against the evening chill. "I am going to sign the divorce papers on Monday, and then I am packing up my apartment. I am done pretending to be something I am not." He expected me to be cruel. He expected me to twist the knife now that he was entirely defenseless. But I had already won the war, and I had no interest in torturing a prisoner. "You were always a terrible operations manager, Mason," I told him honestly. "But you are an incredible salesman. You have the charm to open doors that people like me have to kick down. Look into high-end surgical equipment sales. The manufacturers handle all the heavy logistics and the technical compliance. All they need is someone who can wear a tailored suit. Take the chief of surgery out to an expensive lunch, and close the deal. You would be brilliant at it." Mason stared at me, a flicker of genuine gratitude breaking through his exhaustion. He gave a small, solemn nod, turned around, and walked toward his car. I did not offer him a job at my company, but I gave him a map to find his own way out of the wreckage. 8 months later, the early morning sun reflected off the massive glass double doors of the brand-new North Circuit Clinical Transit headquarters. It was not a drafty cinder-block box. It was a state-of-the-art, 30,000-square-foot climate-controlled facility. We had 60 refrigerated vehicles in the active fleet and a payroll of over 80 dedicated employees. We were managing the supply chain for the largest hospital network in a 4-county radius, and our error rate was virtually zero. We hosted a small ribbon-cutting ceremony in the main dispatch bay. The local Chamber of Commerce was there, along with dozens of my most loyal lab directors and hospital administrators. Tessa stood right beside me, holding the official clipboard, while Eli managed the drone cameras filming the event. My family was standing in the crowd. My mother, Laurel, was beaming, wiping away genuine tears of pride as she watched me shake hands with the city councilman. Mason stood near the back of the room, wearing a modest, standard business suit, looking healthy and quietly content in his new corporate sales role. And standing off to the side, near the massive steel loading doors, was my father. Randall Bridger wore a simple sweater instead of his usual intimidating executive armor. When I finally took the oversized scissors and cut the thick red ribbon, the entire warehouse erupted into cheers. I looked over at my father. He did not step forward. He did not ask for a microphone, and he did not attempt to make a sweeping, authoritative speech about family legacies. He simply stood there, smiling a quiet, humble smile, and clapped for a very long time. He finally understood his place in the room, and as I looked out at the massive, humming empire I had built with my own 2 hands, I realized the most beautiful truth of all. I did not need him to raise a glass anymore, because I never needed his permission to be exceptional. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment letting us know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.